I'm going to talk about anxiety. And anxiety is, on the one hand, a psychiatric symptom, anxiety disorders. But unique, perhaps, amongst psychiatric symptoms, it is also an adaptive state that we all feel from time to time. For example, walking alone in the dark. And so one of the things we're interested in is, at the level of the brain, the level of the mind, what is the relationship between this adaptive, normal anxiety and pathological anxiety disorders? So why would we care about this to begin with? Well, we care because it's very, very common. This is an article from The Observer where it says approximately 1/3 of us will suffer from some kind of anxiety-related problem at some point in our lives. And we can actually see this in NHS data. This is actually data from people admitted for therapy in the NHS. And you can see that amongst the sort of psychiatric disorders that people are admitted for, the biggest bar here, about, again, 1/3, is anxiety and stress-related disorders. And it's actually, almost twice as many as things we also think of as common, things like depression. So anxiety is very, very common, but it's also very debilitating. This is a quote from a journalist with an anxiety disorder, and she says, "Panic comes in lots of flavors. It can run the gamut from a gnawing unease in the belly to a fear that feels like being hit by a bullet train." Now, I like this quote because it captures that idea that, on the one hand, yes, anxiety is this gnawing unease in the belly that we might all feel from time to time, walking home in the dark, giving a talk in front of a room full of strangers, for example. Now, this is a normal adaptive state, right? When you're walking home in the dark, you feel anxious, and it primes you to get away from potential harm. It primes you to run away from the shadows that you see over in the corner. But then, of course, when you get home after walking home in the dark and you turn the lights on, that anxiety should normally dissipate. But then at the other end of the spectrum, we have this, feeling like you're going to be hit by a bullet train, this really quite pathological, unpleasant feeling that can leave people housebound. So the relationship between these two states is something we're very interested in. So anxiety is very common, it's very debilitating, but here's perhaps the crux of the matter. We don't, unfortunately, do a good enough job of treating it. So again, this is data from the NHS. This is, again, people admitted for psychological therapy. And you can see, I put this little blue dotted line here. This is recovery rate, and this dotted line is at 50%, right? And you can see that at least for 2014, 2015, the largest number of people admitted for stress and anxiety-related disorders, but less than half of those admitted will recover. And it's worth noting that the service we have over here in the NHS, a service called IAPT, is arguably one of the best in the world. And CBT is a very well evidence-based treatment, and even so, even with a good service, we're only successfully treating, less than half. The majority of people will not get better. Now, we can add on to that people who recover with the other common treatment for anxiety, which is pharmaceuticals, things like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, and that maybe 30% or so will recover on medication. But even when you add those two things together, we're still looking at maybe 1/3 to 1/4 of people for whom nothing that we have, psychological, pharmacological, will work. So we need to do better. Why do we have this problem? Well, I think one of the reasons is the way that we understand these psychiatric conditions. So the way that you would get diagnosed with an anxiety disorder is using a checklist, a symptom checklist, similar to this. This is the DSM-5. And you can see it's just a list of symptoms. So you might say that I've been feeling restless or feeling on edge, feeling irritable, muscle tension. You have a set of symptoms for enough time, you will get a diagnosis. So you go see your doctor, you say, "Hey doc, I'm feeling anxious." The doctor will say you have an anxiety disorder, and you say, "Why?" And they say, "Well, because you're feeling anxious." Now that's a slightly flippant description, but it's important. It's important to note that the symptoms are the diagnosis. Now that's not to belittle the symptoms. The symptoms are really important. That's of course why you go see your doctor. But the problem with this focus on the symptoms as the endpoint is that the same endpoint can have multiple different causes. So this is an example of something we don't diagnose based on symptoms. We don't diagnose a cough disorder, okay? So a cough is a symptom, right? But we know that a cough could be caused by common cold, hay fever, lung cancer, tuberculosis, bronchitis. All of those underlying fundamentally different biological mechanisms will lead to the same observable symptom. So if you diagnosed based on that symptom and then perhaps selected at random one of the treatments for all of those different underlying biological mechanisms, of course you wouldn't treat the disorder, but you'd also potentially do a lot of harm, right? If you were to treat someone with a cold with the treatment that you'd use for lung cancer, right, that would be really, really harmful. So I think in order to improve the hit rate, to get treatments that close that treatment gap, and to refine our current treatments and target them better, we need to get at the underlying neurobiological mechanisms. So this is what we do, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. So what does that mean? Well, we're here at Mind the Brain. We're interested in the brain. Where do the symptoms of anxiety emerge from at the level of neurons? And then can we use that to refine and improve the way that we measure these underlying mechanisms, therefore improve our diagnoses? And then when we can do that, can we target treatments at those underlying mechanisms? So let's focus first on the brain. All right, so if we want to study anxiety in the brain, as experimentalists, we want to be able to induce anxiety. We want to be able to manipulate it. We want to be able to look at people when they're feeling anxious and then the same people when they're not feeling anxious. So how would we do this? Well, of course, the example I gave, walking home in the dark, we could study people whilst they're in the dark, and we could study them when they're at home afterwards. Slightly difficult. So what we do is we use a technique that we've adapted from animal models. It's a fun technique called threat of unpredictable shock, all right? So how does this work, right? You come into the lab, we'll give you a few shocks, keep increasing it until you say, oh, I don't like that. And then we go, all right, good. That thing you don't like, at some point you're going to get it, right? You ever watch a horror movie and you see someone walking up the stairs and the music's very quiet and you're like, something is about to jump out. Everyone tends to feel a little bit anxious. It's the same. You're worrying that the shock might come. Now, the key thing here is we don't have to shock you at all, right? We just have to make you think you're going to get shocked and you'll be feeling very anxious. But the good thing about this is that we can actually now tell you now you're safe from shock. You're not going to get a shock. So we can compare what your brain looks like before and after this anxiety-evoking condition. So I didn't tell the organizers, right, but I broke in here last night and I wired all your chairs up to electrodes. You are now all at risk of shock. So what we would do is we would have you complete a cognitive task, complete some questionnaires, for example, and then we would say, okay, now you're safe from shock. Now you're risk of shock, safe from shock, risk of shock, safe from shock. So within a sort of 20-minute session, we could look at how you're going to behave, how you perform, what your brain is doing when you're at risk of shock and when you're safe from shock. So interestingly, when we do this to healthy people, what we find is that we can elicit some of the symptoms that we see in anxiety disorders. For example, a symptom of negative affective bias. Now, this is one of the core features of anxiety disorders. What do we mean by it? Well, as we go about our lives, we're bombarded with information. Some of it's good, rewarding. Some of it's bad, threatening, negative information. What we find in anxiety disorders is that the scales of this information processing are just tilted in favor of the negative or threatening information. So you say you go about your life, and in a given day, for the sake of argument, you have 10 specific experiences. 8 of those experiences are good, positive, and 2 of them were bad. At the end of the day, I ask you, how was your day? You'll tell me just about the bad things, ignoring all the good things. That's a sort of selective memory. You're remembering more of the bad things that happened to you. But we see these sorts of effects across all aspects of cognition, attention and memory and so forth. And it's really a core feature of anxiety disorders. But interestingly, when we threaten people with electrical shocks, we can see this same pattern. We induce a negative bias, right? One of the ideas is that this is basically prioritizing negative information. When you're anxious, you prioritize paying attention to, running away from bad things, right? You want to pay attention to bad things. But of course, what you really want is that when you're away from the situation where the threats are there, that your scales will be tilted back in favor. So what we can look at is what in the brain is driving this kind of this behavior. So up here, what I'm showing you is that the pattern of brain connectivity when we take healthy people and we threaten them with electrical shocks, like I just showed you, okay? This is a fearful face because what we're looking at is how people process fearful faces. And what this connectivity map is showing you, this is the amygdala, this little region here that's mapped in yellow. And then up here we have the medial wall of the prefrontal and cingulate cortex. And what we show is that actually these 2 regions start to talk to each other an awful lot more when people are anxious and specifically when they're processing negative information. So this connectivity pattern is what drives the negative bias in the behavior. So it means that when you're under normal conditions, when you're, say, safe from shocks, this circuit won't get turned on. But when you threaten someone with electrical shocks, you make them anxious, all of a sudden this circuit turns on, it drives a bias towards negative information, and you get a negative bias in behavior. It turns on and off when you're anxious, not anxious, anxious, not anxious. So then we can ask the question, like I posed at the beginning, what is the relationship between this and the pathological states, the anxiety disorders? So what we did in this next study is we got rid of electrical shocks, right? We're not making anyone anxious anymore. We're going to take a group of healthy individuals and a group of people with an anxiety disorder, and we're going to look at the same circuitry. What we find here, this is connectivity within this circuit that is greater in people with an anxiety disorder relative to controls. what we find is that whilst in healthy individuals, this circuit turns on and off and on and off, in people with an anxiety disorder, this circuit is always on. It's turned on at baseline without the need to threaten them with electrical shocks. So it's almost like this adaptive mechanism that primes you to detect negative stuff, turns on, off in healthy individuals. In people with an anxiety disorder, it's stuck in the on phase. So then this begs the question, can we modulate it, right? Ultimately, from a clinical perspective, we want to be able to treat people, we want to be able to intervene. So what we did in this next study is we asked a simple question, which is, does the neurotransmitter serotonin, does it change activity within this circuit? Now, serotonin is the precursor, in selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, which are the first-line pharmacological treatment for anxiety disorders. So what we did in this study is we took serotonin in healthy individuals and we lowered it, okay? So what we show is in the same individuals, healthy individuals, this circuit is normally not on, okay, as we've shown before. But when you lower their serotonin, all of a sudden, this circuit gets turned on again, right? So what this means is you can take healthy people, you can make them anxious, you'll turn this circuit on, or you can lower their serotonin and you'll turn this circuit on. So it suggests that serotonin might be applying the brakes to this circuitry. And this gives us a hint as to what things like selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors might be doing to this circuitry and why they might treat these disorders. And so something we're going to be doing over the next 2 or 3 years is actually looking at people with anxiety disorders and looking at them on these medications and seeing if it actually changes activity in this circuit. And then the final thing I want to show you from a brain perspective is the second, the most common actual treatment for anxiety are psychological interventions. So then we ask the question, is it possible to change activity in this circuit using a simple psychological instruction? So in this study, we take healthy people, we threaten them with shocks, and we show that this circuit turns on and off, but then we just give them a simple instruction, which is, on half of these trials, don't pay attention to the negative information, don't pay attention to the fearful faces. And what we find is that when we do that, all of a sudden activity in this circuit gets turned off, okay? So it suggests that you can actually modulate activity in this circuit just by a simple psychological instruction. So again, this gives us a clue as to what CBT might be doing, what therapy for anxiety might be doing. Over time, it might be tuning down activity in this circuit. And again, that's something we're looking at over the next couple of years. Okay, so we can get a nice picture of what's going on in the brain, perhaps, during some of the symptoms of anxiety. But really, how do we actually get from these pretty patterns of brain activity to behavior, right? How is it that the pattern of neuronal activity actually generates the behavior that we see in anxiety disorders? And this is where the sort of relatively new field of computational psychiatry comes in. What is this? Well, basically, we know that neurons, they fire, they have patterns of activity, they have frequencies, right? They can perform simple mathematical computations, simple mathematical functions. Can we, using mathematics, write down the sorts of functions that neurons might do, right? And if we can do that, can we use it to generate behavior that we see in, say, an anxiety disorder? Just to give you a quick example of this. This is, and you don't have to worry about what this graph means at all, but it's behavior. This is a graph of healthy people and anxious people, real people performing a real task. Now, we can write down some mathematical equations and essentially try to create an artificially intelligent agent using these mathematical equations that can also generate behavior. And that's what this pattern down here looks like. And hopefully it's relatively convincing. These two patterns look pretty similar. These are real people. In green we have healthy controls. In black we have anxious patients. In the bottom, these are computerized healthy controls and computerized anxious patients. And they look relatively similar. So we can build these mathematical models, these artificially intelligent agents that behave like anxious people. Why on earth would we want to do that? Why would we want to, somewhat flippantly, create something like Marvin the Paranoid Android from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy? Well, actually, the reason we'd want to do that is because if we can build an artificial agent that can behave like an anxious person, we can ask, what is it about that agent that makes them behave more like the anxious person? And in this particular case, our model actually has 8 parameters in it, and there's one of the parameters is important, and it's this one we call avoidance bias, and it's more active in the people with an anxiety disorder, or the anxious robots, if you like, and it's driving a negative bias. So we've been able to now mathematically write down a series of equations that can generate negative bias. So we can now potentially, in the long run, map that onto the underlying neurobiology. So we can say neurons can do these sorts of maths. Maybe the maths that they're doing is this, and maybe it's this particular parameter that we need to target in order to be able to improve symptoms in people with an anxiety disorder. Okay, so that'll allow us potentially in the long run to bridge the gap between brain and behavior. We can measure these things and we can use them to perhaps improve diagnoses in the long run. But really, the final goal, the ultimate thing we want to do is improve outcomes for patients. That's why we do what we do. So can we use this to inform treatment? So as I mentioned at the beginning, people with anxiety show a negative bias. The scale's tilted in favor of negative information. Can we tilt them back again? Now there's lots of ways we might be able to try to do it. We could do it with CBT, we could do it with an antidepressant medication. But some of the things we're looking at towards in the future is, can we use cognitive tasks? Can we use training procedures to try to change this? Now I should add that this is all very much kind of preliminary work, and there's a question as to whether this will work at all. We're trying our best to find out. So for example, we can create simple computer games and we can have people complete them. Now this is actually an example of one we've been working on with a company called Peak, where we actually try to train people to pay more attention to this happy smiley chap cartoon and not this other chap down here. Now, with these sorts of training procedures, we can shift people's performance on the tasks. This is actually a different task, but there's about 100 people, and you can see that I mentioned we have negative bias. The opposite of that is a positive bias. In this case, we've got healthy individuals. We've got an active condition where we're trying to train their biases, and you can see that their positive bias is increasing. And we also have a control condition, a sham condition, where we don't shift their behavior, and you can see that they don't really change. And then when we do this, we can find on some tasks, on some questionnaires and so forth, we can see changes in how people feel. So this is just one measure. And it's a hint that actually this particular training procedure can change the way that people respond to stressful life events. So you can see at the first condition, time 1, before they've done the training, both these groups show that this is a questionnaire that says how stressfully are certain life events for you. You can see that they look the same, but at time 2, those who've undergone the training say that specific life events bother them less, okay? So it just suggests that maybe we can shift these biases, and moreover, it can have an impact on people's symptoms. So something we're doing right now, actually, and it's this image that I just showed you, is to try to look at whether this works at a population level, right? These are really, really simple games. They might have a very, 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 very small effect, but if they have a very, very small effect, at the level of a population, large numbers of people, this can have a big knock-on effect. So in this case, this is a relatively recent sort of preliminary data. We've got about 50,000 people. We can see that when we do this sort of training, we can change people's performances. Okay, so the goal is to try to use our understanding of the underlying neurobiological activity, these sorts of negative biases, to inform treatments that we can then use to try to tune those negative biases and hopefully improve symptoms. So get all the way from patterns of brain activity to improve measurements of those, to improve diagnoses, to improve treatments, with the overall goal of being to try and push this bar further forward. Can we get recovery from anxiety disorders closer to the 100% mark than the 50% mark? Thank you very much for your time.